Good afternoon. Welcome to panel session number 3 under the topic The Emperor's New Clothes, Straight Talking and Solutions for Financial Integrity and Transparency in Sports. This is it's very, for me as a sports lawyer, is a great opportunity to be here. I thank SIGA, I thank my dear friend Emanuel Medeiros that had this crazy idea of setting up SIGA and defining some common standards on sports integrity and implement them on a worldwide basis. So it's also a play. I'll make an introduction now on the topic, and then we have the other members of the panel. One is here, Matt. The others are online. I hope they will connect soon, and then I will introduce them once they're ready to go. So this is a very, as I said, a very interesting topic regarding financial integrity and transparency in sports. As we know, just to give you an idea, the sports industry generates every year something like $80 billion as a revenue. The sports industry, I mean the football industry, out of this 80 is around 33 billion, which corresponds more or less to 40%. And we have had issues, of course, in terms of integrity, transparency, and sustainability in sports. To give you an idea, according to some recent numbers, around 80% of European clubs does not publish their accounts, their income, their remunerations, their expenses, etc. And 77% of European clubs, in terms of football, are close to insolvency or facing difficulties, of course. And so this means that sport is, in a way, vulnerable to corruption and other forms of organized crime. And this is something that we should pay attention. On the other hand, there's some financial concentration of on football, and the 4 major leagues, they have 60% of all the revenues, and only 11% of the clubs. So we have we are really facing a problem in terms of moral responsibility. We have issues that will be addressed in other panels and in other sessions, like match fixing, money laundering, trafficking, tax evasion, all that. And we have had many cases of bankruptcy in football clubs, so together with corruption and some scandals also in the world of football. So there are some threats to integrity, and I will start with Matt Page. Matt is the managing director of BSI in UK and Ireland. And Matt, you're a specialist, and your organization is specialized in defining standards in many different business sectors. But in terms of sports, what is your experience? And if you can also develop what you think of the standards in terms of financial integrity that SIGA has enacted and is trying to implement on a worldwide scale.
Hello. Thank you, Fernando. Just to say a little bit more about my experience. I'm by no way an expert in the sports industry. I'm a keen, if somewhat incompetent participant and a passionate fan, but I'm not an expert in the industry. However, I have spent my career. I started my career working at PwC as a financial auditor. I then moved into industry, setting up internal audit and risk operations for organizations. And in the latter stages, I've worked for BSI for a number of years and run the part of the organization in the UK and Ireland that's responsible for assurance and providing assurance to organizations, all based around standards. So to answer your question, which is what I think are the most sort of important aspects of standards and how that can help the sporting industry, and where I'd go first, I would say there were probably 2 areas I would pick up. Firstly, and I'll give you an example of each. Firstly, I would say the way I've seen standards work most effectively across other organizations and industries, you start with governance. And actually, I think the finance integrity standard has to be built off the governance standard in SIGA, and that's the same across all industries. The most effective and valuable standards that deliver the biggest impact to industries are the ones that cover the governance of the management, the processes, the systems, the culture of the organization, and work across that organization. Because if you're looking at trying to solve a problem like sustainability or finance with a specific standard, you have to get the governance and the culture right. And the example I'll give you on that area is actually from the aerospace industry, which is actually quality in the aerospace industry. So the manufacture of the aerospace industry, almost the whole industry and every company within the supply chain uses a specific quality standard that's an all-encompassing quality standard on aerospace. And at the heart of that standard is around governance and the governance of that industry. And you really can't supply to the aerospace industry up to the tier ones unless you have your governance right and unless you apply that standard. And I'd just say that just the second area I was going to pick up was around it works best when it's the broader industry that adopt the standard. So just one organization or one entity adopting a standard has a powerful impact for that organization. But nowadays, with the complexity of all industries, and the sporting industry is the same, it has to be the ecosystem. So the challenge, I think, for us, for SIGA, in the rollout of the standards and the value of these standards, is to ensure that it isn't just pockets. It really has to be embraced and engaged by the industry across all the parts of the network of the industry, because that's when you really get the value. And the example I'll give for that is actually right back in history to the start of BSI and the first standard that was developed. Back in the, I guess, 1800s, late 1800s in London, trams, very early trams, there were about 30 tram companies in London operating trams. Each one had a different gauge or width of rail because there was no standard operation. So every manufacturer of a tram for each of these 30 companies couldn't travel across London. So if you wanted to travel across London, you had to get off and on trams many times to get across London. And the organizations didn't work together. They were competing against each other. And this existed was prevalent for a long time. A group of engineers got together and actually realized that if they could standardize the gauge, the width of trams and some of the wheels and the fittings of trams, they could save the industry an absolute fortune. And they developed the first standard, and that was those engineers formed together and created the British Standards Institute, which created a first standard on trams, saved that industry an absolute fortune, and also at the same time created the International Standards Network organization. And that started the whole value of standards. And that, to me, shows if one organization had adopted the standard, it wouldn't have been particularly valuable. It took the industry as a whole to adopt the standard to really leverage the full potential of standards.
Well, thank you. Matt, if we would have such an organization and we would start with defining some good governance principles or standards, where would you start in terms of, let's pick up a sport, football, for instance. What if you had just one chance to make one change, where would you start? Which would be, in your opinion, the first card you would use?
So I'm answering this, I guess, as going back to my initial caveat of my expertise or lack of it on the sporting world specifically, but from an observer from the public and understanding how finance and in business works, the area that I think in football has the biggest challenge that we from outside the industry look at is the crazy world of transactions that happen across that organization, in terms of players or clubs changing ownership, changing relationships, and that process is opaque, confusing, appears to make no sense, and from when in terms of press comment on it and the observations of us fans, I would say that's the biggest challenge to the integrity of the sporting world, the football sporting world. It to me feels the area that in financial integrity, if we can get that right and transparent and to have integrity and it to be perceived as having integrity and actually having integrity, I think would buy an awful lot of goodwill and trust into the sporting world.
Yeah, thank you. It's still the idea of the clearinghouse that FIFA is talking for so long. That would be, of course, something very good in that sense, in that perspective. Maybe also finishing the transfer windows that we have at the moment that concentrate all the financial and transfer of the players in a certain in 2 moments of the year, in a particular time of the year. Thank you very much. So Matt, I'll move to the next panelist. I don't know if we can connect to Philip Rasmussen. There he is.
Afternoon.
Philip, how are you?
I'm very good. Yourself?
I'm fine, thank you. Okay, Philip, to introduce, is the head of financial fair play at UEFA. Thank you very much for being here. I know you couldn't make it to Portugal, but still you're there, so we can see you, we can hear you perfectly. Philip, talking about financial integrity, and there's talking at the same time to someone that with such a relevant role at UEFA, and the first question that comes to my mind is financial fair play regulations that have been enacted in 2010, I think, and implemented since 2011. What is the experience that UEFA had over these last 10 years of applying these regulations? And so I'd like to hear from you on that, and what is the contribution that these regulations have given to a more sustainable football and football clubs.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Thanks, Matt, also for your contribution, which was very, very interesting. Maybe a word briefly. So my name is Rasmussen, as you said. I'm the head of financial sustainability here at UEFA. I've been with UEFA for 13 years, so a long time. Before that, I worked for about a decade in the finance industry. Like Matt, I started in accounting, so with Deloitte, not PwC, and then I worked in investment banks for a number of years. So my skills are more on the number side and less on the playing field side, if we can say so. Wish I was a better player. I get reminded that every week when I try to do something on the pitch. But back to your question and financial fair play, which is the previous rules we have, and I think we'll jump into the actual rules we have today. And Matt mentioned standards. It might be worth stepping one step back further than that, which is club licensing. So back in the last century, let's say, in 99, there was a start of a project that by Andrea Traverso, bringing club licensing on a European scale at UEFA. And this was first implemented back in in 2004 for the 2004-2005 season, which is basically some standards to be respected by each club, or criteria to be respected by each club on a various number of fields, so sporting, personal, administrative, infrastructure, and also importantly legal and financial criteria, which was like a ticket to get into the UEFA club competitions. And this proved useful in terms of also increasing the standard in each of the federations. And to Matt's point before, we also have something which is called the UEFA standard, which is ensuring that each licensor in each federation works to a certain level of standards. So looking at the process and not only at the end result. So this was all good. Nonetheless, coming 2008-9, there was a number of weaknesses which were identified. Namely, we can name a couple. We had a number of clubs that were basically not settling their financial obligations on time. So that's typically transfers. That's typically wages to players or to social and tax authorities, items due to social and tax authorities. And also the losses side was obviously increasing massively. And we're talking on an aggregate basis, losses that were increasing year on year, even though revenues were increasing year on year. And you reached, when we got to 2011, the number of aggregate losses for the top division clubs in Europe was about 1.7 billion euros. So there was basically a call from all stakeholders to do something, and we had a very big consultation process, including all the stakeholders in the football family, and the output of this was the UEFA financial fair play regulations, which were approved, as you said, Fernando, back in 2010. And these regulations have been in place for more than a decade, and they brought a number of results, which I think we've discussed at length, but it would be more appropriate, I guess, for a longer discussion. But in summary, I would say the first point was definitely the reduction in overdue payables, which was reduced by more than 90% compared with the levels we noticed at the beginning of the implementation. And we think this is obviously key in terms of obviously clubs being paid for transfer transactions, employees being paid on a regular basis. So I thought this was definitely important. At the same point, we saw a turnaround in the profitability of clubs, going from those losses that I mentioned to moving up to a profitable level on aggregate at the European level before, obviously, the pandemic hit a couple of years ago. And the other aspect definitely was around transparency, with more professionalization in the clubs, so clubs better structured, and also more transparency in the information. So typically there's requirements around the publication. If you want a license, you need to public your financial information. You need to publish the amount that you have paid to agents. So these are some of the elements in transparency, together with typically publications that are made by UEFA and other stakeholders. In UEFA, typically it would be an item such as the benchmarking report, where we give more and more information about the clubs, the financial side of the clubs, to ensure there's also better understanding among the public and the stakeholders on what we are actually talking about. So I think this was the financial fair play side. I think when we got to the pandemic, we have to say also that the market evolved a lot on many aspects, whether it be the size of the revenues, which you mentioned at the beginning, whether it's been ownership structures, and also some weakness of the regulations that were identified. And last but not least, the pandemic, which shook the industry to its core, and therefore there was a decision to have a overall discussion to basically make the regulation, have a step change the regulation, move to what we have today, which is the financial sustainability regulation, which is an evolution of this financial fair play regulations. So I don't know if that answers your first question.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Before going a bit more on those new financial sustainability regulations that you mentioned, let me ask you one thing. Is okay? We had the financial fair play regulations. We certainly agree that they were not perfect, but they were a first big step to control overdue payables, as you said, to give some transparency and all that. But in a way, they were, as you know, they are just applicable to clubs entering in UEFA competitions. And so basically, UEFA relies that the local championships, the local leagues, will have their own regulations to control the finances or the clubs with their own national licensing, of course. But what happens is that in leagues like the Portuguese league, we only have like six or 7 or 8 clubs that regularly enter into UEFA competitions, and of course, in that way, they must apply and the financial fair play regulations. Why not defining some common standards that would be applicable to all competitions, to all leagues? What do you think about that?
Thanks for your question. I think there is this commonality. So the first step, as I said, is the licensing. I said every club that wants to play in European competition needs a UEFA license, and these are the minimum criteria, which also talk obviously about legal and financial criteria to be respected. And obviously this applies to the 237 clubs that do play in our competition on a yearly basis. But this is obviously at the beginning of the season, you don't know who's going to qualify. So you mentioned a number of clubs in each league might qualify, but all those that aspire, you want to think that you actually need to respect, try to achieve those standards to qualify. And in some years, obviously some clubs do not get the license and they don't get to participate. And this can create, incentive even for those lower to respect and to try to achieve this license in order to qualify. You can only go back, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2014, where the UEFA Europa League winner was Sevilla. And Sevilla were only placed 9th in the Spanish league. They got through because one club higher up had financial trouble, and another club that would take in its place didn't apply for the license. So Sevilla only got in because they actually had the standards that apply for the license and brought them to actually entering the Europa League and then winning it. So I think that's the first one. The second one is when the clubs come into Europe, the assessment or some of the criteria, we can go into detail if you wish, is they look back typically at 3 financial years in the past. So if you ever think of qualifying, you should respect those regulations all the time. If you don't qualify a year, because it will come back and bite you, if I can say as such. So clubs should always respect it. The last one is, and I agree with you, I think we have discussions with the various stakeholders, and the leagues is one very important stakeholder with Klaus here, is the various leagues or the various national associations, they do, depending on the level, also introduce some regulation at the domestic level. And we do think, and I agree with you, that those regulations are extremely important because they cover the full top division. So if it's a top league of 20, it will cover the 20 clubs in the top division. So this is absolutely true. And if there is domestic regulations, we can only encourage them, as they will also be well tailored to the environment at the domestic level. The supranational, so at the UEFA level, are obviously also very important because they ensure a common standard across the board for all the clubs in the UEFA competitions.
Okay, thank you. Philip, just one more before I pass to the next panelist. Please tell us in a couple of minutes what are the new big changes with this financial sustainability regulations? What is ahead? Sure.
I'll keep it brief, and I got that from your intro. So like I said, I think post-pandemic, there was a very big consultation process with the stakeholders. So we talked to the national associations, the clubs, the leagues, the players' union, the supporters, the European institutions, Commission, Parliament, and Council of Europe. And there was also, we had even a convention, including also agent, broadcasters, and sponsors. And there come a number of key themes that were put forward to ensure that the regulations evolved. There was a need for change, and they evolved in the right direction. I think the key one to hear is the key objective is financial sustainability. This is the objective of these regulations. There can be many things that are tackled, but the key objective is financial sustainability of European club football. And basically we came out of this, at the discussions, we wanted to be sure the regulation applied to the different clubs, whether it's different sizes of clubs, different legal forms of clubs. He wanted to address better cost control, better protection of creditors. So the output of this, if you wish, is an evolution of the financial fair play regulations, which basically cover 3 pillars. On the first pillar, which we call solvency, I think this is a reinforcement of what you would call the overdue payable. So we ensure even more that the clubs are paying other clubs, are paying their employees and social and tax authorities. They're basically being checked every quarter. And this is sometimes being overlooked. This is very important. And especially during the pandemic, we saw how important this rule was, because we think it forced clubs to keep paying other clubs, and it avoided that we had a complete freeze of the system, which was extremely important in these very difficult years of the pandemic. So this is one of the key pillars with the solvency. The second of the 3 pillars is the stability, which is basically, it's called the football earnings rule, which is a rule that looks back 3 years. It's an evolution of the previous break-even rule, which many of you will be familiar with. And basically, it looks at the profit and loss of a club over the past 3 seasons and ensure there's not basically too many losses, that the clubs works with it, the revenue it generates, and the level of losses, which is called the acceptable deviation, is limited over a 3-year period. There is no mandatory profitability of the club, but the number of losses, the amount of losses needs to be limited. And the third one, which is the new one, which is important, is a new cost control requirement, which basically is a ratio looking at the cost of a squad compared to its revenue. When we're looking at a squad, is you might have a small squad, 30 players. So it's those 30 players. If you have a big squad of 130 players, it's going to be those 130 players divided by the revenues of the clubs. And we say revenues is the operating revenue plus obviously the transfer activity, which is always an important part of the revenues for many clubs across the continent. And this is a new ratio on the cost control side, which will be monitored, which we feel is very important. And the other aspect, which is key to target one of the weaknesses of the previous regulation, is this measure will be assessed over a calendar year. And in a very brief sense, this means all the clubs in the competition will be assessed from January till end of December during the competition. So typically, if it was now, it would be till the 31st of December of this year, which means we are looking at the squad that qualified the club, the squad that is, if you wish, playing the group phase, and very importantly, a topic which we mentioned at the beginning, the summer transfer window. And this allows basically an assessment by the club financial control body, which is the body that actually assesses if the clubs respect the regulation. We can assess before the end of the season whether a club respects the regulation or not, and have, if need be, sanctions by the beginning of the next season. So there's a timing element which ensures quicker assessment, which is very important. And maybe to close this, the idea always for us is we want to encourage clubs to obviously respect the regulation. The aim is not to punish a number of clubs, but to basically help the clubs becoming more sustainable and have better financial sustainability for European club football.
Philip, thank you very much indeed. That was very clear. We move on to the next panelist. We have Klaus Thomsen. I don't know if he's ready. Klaus is the chairman of the European leagues and also the CEO of the Danish Professional Football League, member of the Professional Football Strategy Council of UEFA. Klaus, good afternoon. I trust you feel better than what we've talked early this morning, and your voice was not that clear. I hope you feel better. Welcome to the panel. Talking about financial integrity and transparency, one of the main issues and topics that I can think of is club ownership. And the first question I have for you is, when are we going to have at the European level some common standards or regulations in terms of club ownership, disclose of who are in fact the owners of football clubs, up to the ultimate beneficial owner, so that we can trace conflict of interest and feel that the competitions are actually played on the field?
No, thank you very much, and thank you for your question. And pardon my voice, the good old flu is still there, not only COVID, but no, I think on one hand, it's difficult to imagine common European standards on ownership, on transparency in ownership. It's of course an option to have the same effect as Philippe has described on club licensing, which I agree. You know, the de facto effect of UEFA's club licensing is that in most leagues will implement the licensing demands of UEFA and then have national adaptations besides that, because that's the way it practically works. So I think if you're looking for a common European development in this area, it needs to come from a European competition. I think that's the way you can start and work with it. I think that but it's going to be difficult because there are different national legal standards that you have to adhere to. Okay. But working with it, I find is extremely important, and we've done it in the Danish league recently and introduced regulations, not on ownership actually, because legally you cannot regulate change in ownership in a Danish legal context. You're free to shift your assets to another owner in a private entity if you choose to do so. So what we actually regulate, and there are two places we can regulate, either in the licensing of the clubs or what Matt mentions in the transaction of players. So if ownerships in the Danish clubs, more than a third of the ownership or control of a Danish club shifts now, the access to enter into player contracts automatically is retracted from this club, and only when this club fulfills demands to transparency, basically being information on ultimate ownerships, with everything down to whatever entities the owners own more than 5% of nationally or internationally. On top of that, having protecting the integrity of the competition, which is other places known as a fit and proper test, which is that if the documentation does not show that you do not adhere to a certain set of standards, you're not giving back your license to enter into player contracts. And that's having, being convicted of economic crime, being in bankruptcy quarantine, bankruptcy history, activities in countries with a high ranking of corruption, money laundering, or financing of terrorism, influence in a betting company, influence in among agents. And as something I think that we are the first to have done, also ultimate control of national states. So, and coming back also to something interesting that Matt says, because the last demand can seem rather banal, but especially if we're talking international investors, I think this is important, that there's actually a mandatory training of new investors in the rules of Danish football and in the general labor market and other relevant rules in a Danish business context. So I think that working with these things have a lot of perspective, but I think it's difficult, even when we work with this in the Danish league, it's a topic of high controversy as soon as you're entering to trying to have regulations around ownership. It's not a banal thing, and usually you cannot do it with the ownership itself. But and I also think we need to remember when we do this that it's obvious that football owes tremendous gratitude to the investors and the owners, be it all the way from fan ownership to institutional investors. They are some of the most important actors in the development of football. So what we want to do is not to prohibit investments, it's to ensure that the field that investors are entering into is a better, more prosperous, and more valuable field and more secure field than otherwise. That's the real task of doing this. And I think what we've done here, some of the development we've looked into and what I think is needed to look into, because to be honest, in the Danish league we've had very good experiences with investors, also international investors. But what we're seeing is an increasing speed of transaction, clubs being traded overnight, things like this. And what we need to ensure is to enter into these transactions and ensure the quality of it for the benefit of all investors.
Yeah,
so
I agree with you.
I think that's it's a long answer, but I think that's the direction, and it needs to be adapted to national legal standards. Otherwise, it won't function. And then there's the issue of, can you do something with European competitions that can travel down like the licensing system did?
Yeah, Klaus, I agree with you. You just said that clubs are traded overnight, and that's exactly what happens. What concerns me and working in this area is, at least FIFA says they finished, but TPO had been banned in 2000 and 2015. I don't believe, but if they say it's true, it's okay. But and from then on, investors, they shifted their investments from TPO to club ownership. But the exact same problems we had with TPO, we have with club ownership. And basically we're talking about conflicts of interest and sport influence in sports decisions. And those we have with club ownership unless we know who in fact are the owners, the shareholders up to the ultimate beneficial owner of these football clubs. And so that's really a concern, because someone that we don't know has the power to maybe change the outcome of a competition in the middle of the season by strengthening or weakening a certain club to another. And we have a transfer window in the winter and all that. So my question to you is, how are the European leagues dealing with this? The situation is not only, of course it's important, as you said, to know exactly who is coming in, but how do you monitor the conflicts of interest of knowing exactly who's behind these clubs?
It's a big problem, because the truth is that in part we're monitoring, saying who are the ultimate owners and how is ultimate ownership, or some leagues are. My belief is that we need to have this implemented across leagues, that you should not be capable of owning a club if it's not probably disclosed what the ultimate ownership is. But I think what you're referring to is the phenomenon, and I agree that we've seen TPO, and part of this clubs changing hands overnight. Part of that is seeing that TPO has traveled into club ownership instead of player ownership. And there are two answers to that. The one is that what the FIFA reform on the transfer system is increasingly important to get in place and expand. The other one is that we need to have a discussion on multi-club ownership, because this is what we're talking. It's strange. It's a strange thing that owners, whether they're disclosed or not, but can shift 7-8 players from one club in a small and medium-sized league to another one in mid-season, for instance. And what does this do to the integrity of the competition? I think it's something we haven't got an answer for, to be honest, and we will have to look into it, because it's a phenomenon that has spread quite quickly. And again, if I use the Danish context, we have some examples of an ownership with multi-club owners functioning very well, but we also have the opposite example. What the mechanisms of regulation in this area, I mean, it's an easy one according to the European competitions, and I think that's a given, and I think UEFA already ventured into this, that's not an option. But the impact on the national leagues we need to work with, and it's a very difficult topic, but I think it's one of the critical ones when we work with the new regulations on ownership. I think that one of the conclusions was that one of the next topics that we have to monitor and we have to follow up on and see what do we do with is the multi-club ownership. But where the solutions lie and how you prevent regulations from also limiting football is not clear to me.
Yeah, also I agree with you. Also related with this is the question of who is capable of being a board member of a football club. I don't know what European leagues thinks about that, because in some countries we have fit and proper tests for board members of football clubs. In others we don't. In Portugal, for instance, you need a criminal record to become an intermediary, but to be a board member, basically you need nothing. You just need your tax number and that's it, and your address. So it's what is the European leagues also think about that, and in terms of what are the proposals on the top of the table in terms of financial integrity?
I think it's not the area I would choose to regulate, partly because it's very difficult. That's one. But I think it's an area you regulate in the sense of you're regulating ownership, because when you do regulations on ownership, it's not on ownership per se, it is on ownership per se, but it is on control of the club. And it's actually in our regulations that if control shifts in terms, it can shift in terms of ownership, but it can also shift in terms of control over the board by a certain group of persons, then we will have the same regulations and the same test that we enter for a shift in ownership. I think on individual board members, I think it's very difficult. There's one thing I would like to mention, because Philippe mentioned overdue payables, and across the system, I think this is key to regulate many of the investors we do not want, and many of the ways we do not want to see our clubs run, that we have strict regulations in terms of overdue payables, that you lose your license to enter into new players contract immediately if you have overdue payables. In the Danish league, we're looking into that. If wages are not paid, will it then have a sporting sanction in terms of losing 3 or more points in the competition, and other regulations? And I think we need to be extremely firm on the issue of overdue payables, because because a characteristic of a lot of the ownerships and investments we do not want is the inability to pay everyone what these people owe, because the control of cash flows and doing weird things with the cash flows is important to these business models. So in my view, the overdue payables and being extremely firm on those are one of the key tools in the toolbox we need to have at all times.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, Klaus, thank you. I know you made an effort with your voice. Thank you for that. Okay, we move on to the next panelist. We have João Pedro Paro Neto, is the president of the Southern Cone of MasterCard. João Pedro, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here with you guys.
We're very pleased to have you here with us. I'd like to, in this panel, I'd like to, to talk about the role of the sponsors in terms of sports, and how does MasterCard sees that with all the involvement of sponsors. How do you see questions such as corruption, commission fees, whenever MasterCard wants to sponsor a certain championship, a certain federation, a certain competition? How does it reviews everything before actually entering into a sponsorship agreement? Do you care or not whether you're entering into a tender, how the tender is organized, by whom and how? What is your perspective?
Thank you for the question, Fernando. It's a pleasure to talk here. First of all, I would like to make an adjustment on my credentials. I was the former Southern Cone president. Now I am lead the ESG practice for LAC and MasterCard. Also, I'm chairman of the board of the Pacto pelo Esporte, is the entity here in Brazil where we put all the sponsors together, the many sponsors, athletes and so on, looking for bringing rating where we can give more government transparency, integrity to all the different associations that we have in country, also the clubs and so on. So we developed this entity a couple years ago, and we have been growing very fast in a good way. That is good for us. We could practice different kinds of good, let's call good things already. And also we signed recently the SIGA to extend the new rating, let's call that way, we are going to be developing together for LAC. So we are based in São Paulo, this entity, and with SIGA, we are going to be doing this. It was a great pleasure to us to be part of the SIGA as a partnership that we have with them as well. When we start this, Fernando, just talking about what you question us, was very important because we decided years ago, as you know, we sponsor sport for many years. MasterCard is one of the top sports sponsors, has been like that for many years. And when we start talking about the World Cup in 2014 here in Brazil, we start seeing that it was a strong demand to make sure we could bring more integrity to the clubs and to the entities that are going to be sponsored for. So that was the first change we made it. So we started working hard with this Pacto pelo Esporte, and we could put together all the sponsors and make some new governments in place with those different entities. So far, we have a couple good ones already in place. We are improving our rating year over year. So this is great to put together all the needs that we have when we sponsor somebody, and also the other side, who is being sponsored, how they can manage their entity and so on. Consider what I said before, government transparency and integrity. This is not easy for the entities. For example, there is a hard work with CBF, for example, the main football sponsor in Brazil, and they had a long hard work with a consulting company to develop all those different compliance issues, the governance, so on and so forth. So they developed a long list of things to be done to become more close to what we expect as sponsors for those kind of entities. And this has been a new model for our country, and different kinds of entities are doing the same. And we consider I don't want to be part of any sponsorship that I cannot say that we have good practice behind it, because it's very hard to us. Because as we try to do our business, doing well by doing good always, and consider all the ESG practice and so on and so forth, as one of main things to us, how can I be sponsor something that is not aligned to this kind of practice? So this is very, very important. And the other piece to consider is also the development of it. So education and so on, inclusion and things like that as well. So for example, the Women's Copa America that was last July, we could launch different things to support women's. For example, for the first time in this tournament, we could give a prize to the winner. We could bring together the crypto into the benefits. So we launched the first NFT trophy to the to the play of the match and things like that. So we developed different kinds of things already, trying to include more the women's into this scenario. So for us as a sponsor, also is very important to look into the inclusion. So those different elements, always we're going to be looking to it to see how we can do different, how we can do better, to make sure not only us as the sponsor, but also the entity are happy at the end because we are doing better for us as a society. And also consider that sports is something that move our heart, let's call it that way. So everybody loves it. And so it's very interesting to make sure we combine different things. So listen to Philip, to Klaus, and to Matt was very interesting to understand the different things that you guys are doing in Europe as well. And we also are working that same direction because this is become a good practice around the world. Every one of us as a sponsor would be much happier to support those things.
Okay, thank you for that. It was very clear. Let me develop a little bit on that. How do you secure ourselves as a major sponsor in sports all over the world? How do you secure yourselves in terms of bribery and corruption regarding securing sponsorship? We're not talking about, of course, you don't want to be associated to sports which are involved in corruption cases, and you mentioned that, of course, or are involved in bad practices. But how do you, in terms of sponsorship, how do you secure that things are done properly, the way you want them to be done?
Fernando, I think there is a combination of things. First of all, you have to make sure that there is a good, let's got a good practice of compliance in place in those entities. So this is the first thing we try to look into it to see if those guys, they are doing what they should do and what's behind it to make sure they have those in place. The second thing we have to work very hard is about the contract, how we can align those things and make sure they can be committed to whatever we want them to make sure things go in the right direction. So also we spend a long time doing those things to make sure it's okay. And the third piece of it is to make sure that who are you talking to? Who are the ones behind it, those things? How this contract is going to be managed? How those things are going to be happening? How the other sponsor can be together and pushing for it in the same direction. So I think this combination makes things, let's say, more transparency and makes things a little easier to manage. So we could handle those things better. But at the end, as you know, we cannot make sure that 100% of the things are going to be clear, transparent, so on and so forth, although we try to do all those different elements. But if you have ways to track as well, is very important. So as we do a sponsorship, we don't forget about it, just give the money and forget about it. We have to be together and have to make sure you're going to be aligned and support and working together to make sure things happen the way it should happen, because this is the way to change the mindset behind those kind of things and skip from the briberies and things like that. Because it's not an easy thing. Although you can say anything, you can put in a contract. I like to say the contract, you can write whatever you want. The problem is how you make it happen in the right way.
Pedro, one final question. You've been at MasterCard a committed supporter of SIGA from the beginning. Why SIGA, and what are the reasons for all this backup you're giving SIGA?
Well, I think the main reason is to make sure we are aligned with associations or entities that can help us to do a better sport, better quality, in a better level, in a sustainable way. And when we start thinking about governance, the G of the ESG is extremely relevant in anything we do. If we don't do that in ourselves, and we push our partners to do the same thing, and the entire ecosystem to do the same thing, we are not going to be in the right place. So that's the idea. That's why we try to always to be very, very strong behind those kind of things to make sure MasterCard get aligned to who we should in a good way. It's like I said before, is a long journey. It's a long journey. We can say that we can start working around those things and improve year over year. We can have commitments, we can have targets and things like that to make sure things improve in the way it should be. Because it's not a thing that you already done, already said. Klaus talked a lot about ownership and things like that. It's not a simple thing. It's not a simple thing to connect to those things and make things more connected to what we would like to see it. But the way we think we are doing, being part of those different kinds of association as SIGA and so on, is relevant because those are one way to show that we want to be committed to good practice. I think that's the best way to see this kind of partnership.
Well, thank you very much for that. Okay, some time flies and we're close to the end. Matt, coming back to you, some final remarks from all we've discussed and heard in this panel.
Thank you. Yeah, just reflecting on my other panelists, Klaus, Philippe, and João. It's not easy, is it? Some of these areas, it's a challenging environment. It's really encouraging to hear the comments made and the improvements that are looking to be made, and it's made me reflect that every part of the ecosystem has a role. The sponsors clearly have an important role. The associations, the leagues, the bodies that organise the sport, the organisations themselves have a role, and the tool of standards and the independent rating and verification scheme is part of that. I think fans, members have a role to play on the pressure, but it's worth wrestling with these challenges and these problems, because having seen in other industries when integrity is high and trust is high, it's such a positive environment to drive investment, to drive collaboration, to drive innovation. And all those are needed across the supply chain, and all of those are needed to wrestle with the big problems in the world that Emmanuel summed up in his address earlier yesterday. It does require everyone to be committed, and it can be really positive when they are. And as an ending warning, it can be incredibly bad when there isn't integrity and trust within an ecosystem. It can be catastrophic. It can end careers. It can end organisations. So it's a big prize out there, and there's an opportunity to get it. It was a good discussion, and I think I've taken very positive messages away from that.
Okay, thank you for that. A lot to do, and thank you to have you and BSI on board this amazing integrity project. Philip, the same question to you. Final remarks on this panel of what we have discussed.
Thanks. I think thank you to all the panelists. It was all very interesting viewpoints. Obviously, we are more used to talking with Klaus and the European leagues on a very regular basis. It's obviously also very interesting to hear the opinions of other stakeholders. I think it underlies again. I think what we tried here is to find a good solution. A good consultation process is essential. So it's good to have a good idea, but you need to make sure that you talk to everybody. You mentioned, fan organizations, you go to clubs, leagues, and associations, and that you see the different viewpoints also include other institutions. So whether it's sponsors or broadcasters, and finally, typically the European Union. So the consultation process seems always as a key element in order to get to the right point and find the correct consensus that is applicable and find the right solution. Okay,
thank you very much, Philip, and thank you for being a member of this panel. And good to know that UEFA is fully committed with integrity. Klaus, your final words.
My final words would be that first and foremost, thank you to Wow for being so engaged also in these matters. Although, you know, it's something that the sponsors and others, you know, should just demand, put your house in order. We're the sponsors. So engaging, I think, pays a lot of tribute to you. And also I would say that we should always remember in this, you know, when we're discussing, it's been discussed, was the financial fair play of UEFA a success or not? But I would say, of course, it was a tremendous success. Imagine football without it. And we need to also pay, because this is such a complex area. So nobody gets it right in the first go. And I'm sure we're going to change our regulations on ownership. But, you know, we need to also support everyone who are innovative in this field. And we're not always going to get it right because it is very complex issues. So we should always be open to evaluate and develop. That should be my remark.
Okay, Klaus, thank you very much. And thank you again for being a member of this panel. João Pedro, you were the last but not least, of course, but your final remarks on this from what we've learned this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the panelists. Thank you, Fernando, to SIGA for the event. Congratulations, very nice. I would like to say that sport is a passion. And everything that we put a passion, we have to make sure that we combine the right passion with the right integrity, transparency in governments and the other side, that we have to give back to the fans what they are looking for. Because if you ask a fan, they care less if the club is going to be making money or not. They want titles. But we have to make sure that we can do those two things in the right way because we want a sustainable ways to make the future in a better way. So let's keep working, keep the hard work to make sure all the sponsors get the right place to put their money, invest in good things. On the other side, all the clubs give back and the entities give back to us what is compromised to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your participation and your words. And I'm sure that other sponsors in the world of sports will follow the MasterCard's example. We're about to finish. I think we're about time. Okay, yes. I'm sorry. We are moving on to the signature of an MOU. So I give the floor to Emmanuel Medeiros, and so we can present it. Thank you.
We thank you your participation, but let's keep. Yes, thank you. Let's keep Klaus Thompson online, please, if it's possible, because we have a special moment now. Again, thank you, Emmanuel. We'll have a signature that will be remote, but not less significant between SIGA and Klaus Thompson. I don't know if he's still there. We sure hope so. And the chat with Emmanuel.
I am.
Klaus?
Yes.
There you are, my man. Yes, I am not standing here alone, although this is not the first time today. Something tells me that it won't be the last time. But it reminds me that old tune that is the watermark and the source of inspiration of Liverpool FC. And Matt, I know you are there, so this is for you. You never walk alone because no man is an island, and no challenge is big enough that it cannot be surpassed, it cannot be overcome. And having listened to this amazing, insightful panel with people from different organizations that complement the approach and bring added value to the solutions, I think we have not only the thought leadership, but we have the opportunity, and we need to seize it. I know Klaus for many, many years. We used to write together when I was the CEO of European Leagues, and even before that. And Klaus, one of the most enlightened, forward thinkers in professional football. I have seen the great work Klaus has done as CEO of the Danish League. I have seen how he has given voice and status and stage and gravitas to what they used to say so often, a small league. But it could be small in the number of clubs, it could be small in the size of the country, but by God, it was not small in ambition, it was not small in vision, and it was not small in achievement. Today, Klaus, in addition to his CEO as the Danish League, chairs the European leagues. And that speaks close to my heart. There were many battles we fought together. There were many obstacles we endured and we prevailed. There were many bridges we built. There were many solutions, many best practices that we shared. Advancing. The creation of the European leagues, who at the outset was not even recognized by UEFA or by FIFA, to the respect that this organization that represents today more than 90% of the game's earnings and is, by its own merit, a leader in this space, the largest employee organization in the field of professional sport, with more than 1,000 clubs just in Europe, is the result of many contributions. Klaus is certainly one of those who deserved my applause. And to show that there are no stories ending, but just new chapters to open, following many discussions, following many consensus, and following this shared purpose and shared commitment to drive change, we are now, each one on his own country, signing a memorandum of understanding that lays down on paper our common concerns, our shared priorities, and what we will do, rolling up our sleeves to make it happen. I am absolutely certain that after Klaus, all European leagues, as we have seen today here with the Portuguese League, will also embrace this call to action, will also embrace this moment, and will bring the change that professional football so much needs. So Klaus, thank you. I will sign my paper, and I will meet you halfway so that we can do what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I will be brief. First of all, thank you for your kind words. You know that my honest opinion is that I haven't done much, but in collaboration with all the staff and all my colleagues, UEFA and other organizations, we've done a lot. But thank you very much, Emmanuel. Thank you very much for SIGA as well, entering into this area, giving it the focus it needs on a global scale. It's incredibly important, and it's important that this is someone's focus all the time, because the rest of us, is running around attending everyday business in a highly complex environment. So we cannot give sufficient attention to this, which shows that the importance of SIGA, and I'm sure that SIGA will spark processes that will ensure the sustainability of sports and the integrity of sports across the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, brother, for those heartfelt words, for the support, for what we have done in the past, and certainly for what we will do in the future. And here it is. Here it is. This is where it all starts. And you are all invited to help us to move things forward. Thank you.